Okay, so we're going to try to do this again and see if we can't get the audio back up and running. Let's see here. Because I still don't see the system audio up. So let me know, K-Dub, if you can hear that out there. That would be helpful. Let me know if you can hear it. Let me know if you can hear the audio, okay? Good to see you guys. I'm trying to get this audio to work. Can you guys hear the audio coming through? Can you hear it? What do you think, K-Dub? Can you hear that? Can you hear the audio from YouTube? K-Dub, can you hear it or not? Okay. No, yeah, I'm playing something right now, so I can't really hear it. Let me change one more thing, okay? Let me change this. And you tell me.
Argument from consciousness, the argument from reason that you mentioned
Let's see
address
here.
specifically that epistemological concern that he has. But what about,
You can hear, but it's super low. Okay, yeah, that's what I found.
What if
super low?
this
Okay.
being chose to reveal himself to us?
Well,
now he discounts
that's a
that.
very good point, Kevin.
let's see here.
We're thinking here that we have been abandoned to our own devices to figure out what higher orders of being exist. But of course, the biblical
Can you guys hear that? Is that coming through a little bit better, K-Dub? Because I'm playing something. Now you can? Okay. All right. I'll roll with that. Let's see what we can do with that.
So you're quite right in drawing our attention, not only.
Now we can. Good. Excellent. All right. So I'll give it a shot with that. And for now, we're going to stop him, and we're just going to jump right into tonight's video. Let me just kind of reintroduce the video that I wanted to cover tonight, and that is a video by Capturing Christianity. And the reason I decided to cover this is because they kind of went after presuppositionalism head on, and actually said, they actually said that this is a sound refutation of presuppositional apologetics. And so, I turned it off, so that's why you can't hear it. I'm going to turn it back on here in a second. So let's watch the opening of this, okay? And as we watch the opening of this, I think you're going to get to kind of hear exactly what they're talking about and why I decided to cover this video. So here's the video by Capturing Christianity, and here's the opening clip.
So tell me more about those two approaches and the two main approaches.
So in effect, Cornelius Van Til, who's the fountainhead of American presuppositional thought, who was a professor at Westminster Seminary in the early 20th century, in effect says that any argument for the existence of God that concludes God cannot be the God of Christianity, because the God of Christianity, in his estimation, has to be the presupposition of all argument. So in effect, Van Til would say the assumption or the presupposition of God is the necessary condition for all knowledge. Whereas the classical approach is going to say there are truths about reality that normal human beings with the faculties God has created us with, there are truths that we cannot fail to know as human beings. Mm-hmm. And from those truths, a person can construct, we believe, a demonstrable argument for the existence of God. So it's just basically a debate, if you will, over the propriety of giving arguments and evidence primarily for God's existence.
So are you familiar with?
Okay, so that's kind of his opening line, and so what I wanted to do is kind of remind us of when we're talking about presuppositional apologetics. Remember that there are three principles that we need to follow, as as the simplest way that I can explain this to people is that there are three governing principles that govern the whole procedure of presuppositionalism, which is this. Number one is the nature of ultimate authority and the fact that all worldviews operate off of some ultimate authority. Number two is the idea of epistemology and whether or not a person is epistemically aware. Okay, whether or not you're epistemically self-conscious is the more technical term. And then the other thing is pushing the antithesis, which is to argue by way of presupposition. And so, to me, presup is also a critical assessment, therefore, of worldviews. That's what we need to understand, is that presuppositionalism is what Van Til called an indirect argument. That is to say that we are not arguing bit by bit. We are not going at each other piece by piece, one fact at a time. Presuppositionalism is more comprehensive than that, in that it goes down into the foundations. That's why it's called transcendentalism or transcendental reason, because we're going down below the surface of direct arguments and we're going to the indirect, greater issues that are involved in any argument, which is the worldview issues, which is the matters of epistemology, metaphysics, and those kinds of things, and whether or not your worldview is actually accounting for those things. For example, notice how Dr. Howe here says that he defines his apologetic as something normal human beings with the faculties that God has created us with. That's what's necessary for the classical approach. Now, notice that all of the things that he mentioned there have no meaning whatsoever outside of the Christian worldview. What does it mean to be a normal human being? Well, right now, we're completely redefining what it means to be a normal human being. Just this Sunday at church, I recommended a book on transhumanism. Why? Because there is an effort right now through technology, basically, to redefine what is a human being. What does it mean, after all, to be human? That's a big question that's under debate. And so what it means to be human, unlike what Dr. Howe has said, is not something that we can simply take for granted. What is a normal human being? And then he says, as long as you have the faculties that God created you with. Well, faculties of reason given by God is an assumption based on a particular worldview, namely a Christian worldview. See, there's, in this book by Dr. Bahnsen, Always Ready, there's a chapter in this book. The chapter of this book, which begins on page 99, is entitled Not Lying to Defend the Truth. Why do I bring that up? Because when you are describing your apologetic in ways and categories that reveal a Christian commitment to the Christian worldview, but yet in your method you do not occupy the Christian worldview, in a sense you are lying in order to defend the truth. So what Dr. Howe and what Cameron Bertuzzi are going to do repeatedly, and what happens on Capturing Christianity all the time, is that there is a laying aside of a person's espoused worldview when you engage in the apologetic task. This is precisely where presuppositionalism and all other methods basically part ways. We refuse, in a sense, simply to lay aside the Christian foundations of epistemology, metaphysics, and ethics when we engage in the presuppositional or transcendental act of reason. We just will not do it. And so, for that matter, we cannot begin in the same place. One is a completely revelatory commitment. That's a presuppositional commitment. The other one is a completely non-revelatory commitment. It's a commitment to human reason, but not a commitment to the Word of God in your presuppositions, in your worldview, in your apologetic task, all of that. And so, of course, only a Christian, only a revelation-based assumption can talk about things like normal human beings with faculties that God has given us. It's amazing. On the one hand, Dr. Howe and what Cameron are saying is that you cannot engage in presupposing Christianity, and yet the opening description of his apologetic does exactly that. It presupposes, I know he didn't use the language, but he basically used the conclusion of the argument, which is you're created in the image of God. You have mental faculties that God gave you. That's what makes you a normal human being, because that's how God created us. Well, those are all Christian loaded ideas. No anti-theist is going to tell you that they simply accept the premise of his apologetic, that God created us with certain mental faculties. That's to concede the argument. And so to me, it's just unfortunate that this is the way the argument unfolds. Now, in this next clip, which is a little bit longer, he brings up a very, very important point, which is the distinction between metaphysics and epistemology, or what he refers to as ontology, the older classic term being the term being, and what goes on there. So anyway, let's roll on. We'll just keep going through this clip. I'm sorry the audio didn't work at first. I don't know what happened. Don't blame me, but I guess you'd have to. But anyway, so this is another clip introducing the difference between ontology and metaphysics, and what Dr. Howe says, like, this is the issue. So if you want to know why they called this video a sound refutation of the presuppositionalism, I think Richard Howe would say this is the reason why, and I think that Cameron would also say this is the reason why. It's this argument right here of this distinction that is going to be made. Now listen carefully.
Faithful he is. I take the presuppositional method to be best exemplified by Greg Bahnsen,
Right.
as a disciple of Van Til.
He did a lot of debates and everything.
Oh, absolutely. He's
And
debating.
everyone says that he's like just completely destroyed these guys, the people he's debating. And that's actually one of the things that people say that why presuppositionalism is the best method.
So what's
is because it's
interesting-
so effective.
Well, what's interesting about that observation, I would allege, is that whenever the presuppositionalist actually starts to construct an argument, I've never seen them fail to do exactly what the classical method does. So what they do, basically, this is what I think is a perennial mistake in all that I've read of all the presuppositionalists that I've read, including Bahnsen's material, is that when they define presuppositionalism, they say it this way: the assumption of God is the precondition of knowledge. But when they try to explain what that means, what they end up defending is God is the precondition of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Well, of course, God is the precondition of knowledge because he's the creator, right?
Yeah.
But God is not the same as the assumption of God. And what's interesting is this particular nuanced point came out in Bahnsen's debate with R.C. Sproul in the late 70s. And when Sproul was trying to rehearse back to Bahnsen how he understood Bahnsen's position, it's just an audio, so you're having to visualize. You could almost see Bahnsen shaking his head because Sproul kind of trails off. Oh, that's not what you mean? And here's what the issue was. Bahnsen said, no, we're not merely making an ontological point. We're not merely saying God is the precondition of knowledge. Bahnsen goes on, because that doesn't distinguish the two models. Both the classical, and I think he's right, both the classical approach and the presuppositional approach would agree that God is the precondition of knowledge because he's the creator. What makes the presuppositionalist distinct from the classical is the epistemological question of the assumption of God is the precondition of knowledge. In every place I've ever read any presuppositionalist trying to explain that, he always ends up explaining how God is the precondition. In fact, it's interesting, just before our conversation, I was just having a conversation with a gentleman in the lobby where we are, and he is a presuppositionalist. And I pulled out a Van Til quote on one of my slides of one of my PowerPoint, and within one paragraph, he switches from the presupposition of the truth of Christianity is the precondition of knowledge to the truth of Christianity is the precondition of knowledge. Well, the latter I wouldn't disagree with. That's exactly what the classical model would affirm. God obviously is the precondition.
I like that distinction between the ontological kind of thing and then the epistemological.
Yes.
So what is it that motivates the presuppositionalists to adopt that view instead of the classical view.
So this is one of the things
Okay, there we go. That clip right there is something that we need to interact with, because as you heard both these guys say, this is the perennial issue. I mean, this is perennial issue. I mean, this is it right here. This is what distinguishes, this is what distinguishes the two positions as far as Dr. Howe and Cameron are concerned, is that on the one hand, you have God metaphysically, ontologically as the foundation of knowledge, or you have the argument of the assumption of God. So listen to that distinction, because what it is really is a distinction without a difference. It is definitely a false dichotomy. It is a sad and unfounded false dichotomy, really, because listen to what Dr. Howe says. He says God is the precondition of knowledge because he is the creator, and he repeatedly says in this clip, we know that, and we just know that, which is remarkable, because he ends up in this clip essentially espousing not just the presupposition of God ontologically on presuppositionalist grounds, transcendental grounds. I mean, this is more akin to fideism. We just know, he says. And he says in classical, he'll even say that when he describes the classical method. He'll just say, well, we know there's one God, and we know that that's the God of the Bible, which is exactly what Thomas Aquinas does. He just said, well, we just know that it's God. Well, I'll tell you what, go into any debate with an anti-theist and just tell him, look, after all my arguments to you about the cosmological argument or the teleological or ontological argument or what have you, the moral argument, the column argument, at the end of the day, it should persuade you of a high probability that there is a God. And oh, by the way, we just know that that God has to be the one and true God of the Bible. Not at all. You know, what's interesting is the Westminster Confession talks about what does it say? Something like, that there is a distance between the creator and the creature. And how great is that distance? It is infinite. And so never from human reason and from finite reasoning could we ever come to the conclusion of the one true God, okay, by virtue of human reason. It just will never happen. Why? Because the distance between the creator and the creature is such that it is infinite. And what we need is not a argument based on reason, okay, kind of like Greg Koukল's whole ministry is based on reason, stand to reason, instead of stand on revelation. And so unless we begin with the proposition that we should be defending in all of this is that God has chosen to reveal himself to us. And that's what, honestly, that's what we should be defending over and over and over, is we should be defending the proposition that God has chosen to reveal himself to us. And because God has chosen to reveal himself to us, therefore, without that revelation of God, we can expect the very things that God says in his revelation will happen. Namely, what are the consequences of denying your creator? The futility of mind, everything, the moral dimensions, the epistemic dimensions, the ethical dimensions, the metaphysical dimensions, the aesthetics that will follow a worldview that has denied its creator, etc., etc., etc. And as a matter of fact, he even claims that, in fact, this whole issue was raised by R.C. Sproul in his debate with Greg Bahnsen. Now, I went back and I listened to that debate between Bahnsen and Sproul, and what I found was that when Sproul raised that issue, what ended up happening was that Sproul ended up saying this. He says, we want to move from epistemology to ontology instead of, listen carefully, instead of ontology to epistemology. In other words, what he's saying is we can't begin with the reality of God and then get to human reason. We have to begin with human reason in order to arrive at the reality of God. Again, that a remarkable statement by somebody who actually adheres to the Westminster Confession, because that to me is a complete contradiction to the idea that there's a distance so vast and so infinite between the creator and the creature that it cannot be breached. Not unless God, without some act of divine condescension, has come down. But you see, you must understand, in classical apologetics, you are not defending divine condescension by God, because that's a revelational issue. And you don't defend revelation out of the gate. You defend human reason out of the gate. That's what you do. So ultimately, guys, this is a sad and unfortunate case of, again, it's a false dichotomy to say that we cannot make ontological claims in the same breath that we make epistemic claims. Furthermore, it is a betrayal of God's worldview, because in the worldview of the Bible, epistemology, ontology, and ethics all inform one another. You cannot have one without the other. You know nothing about epistemology without at the same time affirming a certain ontological worldview, and vice versa. And so this is, of course, not something that they're going to cover here. I wanted to read to you guys a little quote here by Bahnsen as he's interacting with Van Til when he talks about the fact that we cannot intelligently think away God's existence. That is to say that by human reason, we can't simply reason away the existence of God. That's not possible. And instead, God is proved to exist according to the presuppositional version of the ontological argument. How? By the impossibility of the contrary. In other words, let me go a little bit slower here. What Bahnsen is saying concerning Van Til, okay, you guys tell me if this makes sense to you. And by the way, your chats are your comments here in the chat, greatly appreciated. God bless you all. Thanks for sticking with us. Thanks for hanging in there. And I see all of you guys. Thank you for the comments. These are great comments, and I think you guys understand what is at stake with these comments. Julio, Brandon, of course, Brother Travis, good to see you. Absolutely. So, again, as we revisit what Dr. Howe and Cameron are trying to argue for here, let me make the case this way, that what's going on here essentially is that what they're trying to do is they're trying to divorce epistemology from ontology. And I wonder, Dr. Howe, if it's possible for you to demonstrate, how do you do ontology without epistemology? How do you do epistemology without ontology? Is that something that you can demonstrate? I doubt it, because as a sentient being, you cannot but engage in epistemology when you're talking about ontology. And so the Bible does not allow us to distinguish between these two, or to separate these two. They are mutually involved. Listen to what Bahnsen goes on to say. Listen carefully, because this is kind of a lot. He says, so then we find that Van Til's presuppositional defense of the faith does not repudiate theistic proofs, but simply insists on formulating them in a way that's faithful to Christian presuppositions. Of course, it's like, how can you make an argument for ontology? How can you make an argument for the ontological argument, the necessity of the being of God? Remember, what is the ontological argument? The ontological argument basically is stressing that God has to exist by necessity. It's better to exist than non-exist. And if a being is perfect, then he must exist. And so how do you make that argument apart from Christian presuppositions? You cannot, and you should not. That's the point. You should not. His complaint against the traditional versions of the cosmological, teleological, ontological proofs of God's existence was that they were formulated, listen now carefully to this quote here by Bahnsen. Van Til didn't reject these classical theistic proofs out of hand. What he's saying is this. These proofs were, we could say, originally formulated, let's say by Thomas and others. They were formulated to accommodate the autonomous reasoning of man. You see how that works? rather than to attack it head on. So in other words, all of the theistic proofs were formulated, they were so structured in order to accommodate neutrality and autonomy, instead of attacking autonomy head on. Instead of attacking the issue of neutrality, instead, these classical proofs were built in such a way that they accommodate, they make room for the notion of autonomy and neutrality. Is that what the Christian worldview is supposed to do? Are we supposed to structure our arguments in order to accommodate autonomy and neutrality? Bahnsen and Van Til, of course, say no. He says this head-on collision is found in the transcendental formulation of the proofs, illustratively applying the challenge that Christianity, listen carefully, is the rational precondition of intelligibility to the notions of causation, order, necessary being. So cosmological, teleological, and ontological arguments. You guys get what is being said there? I think it's amazing. Well, Dobster Dad says, God is not the God you can reason to. He is the God that you can't reason without. Exactly right. Great summary of what Van Til and what Bahnsen are talking about there. Now, I can stay on that little clip there really all night about the distinction between ontology and epistemology, right? God exists on an ontological claim, but is that also not at the same time an epistemological claim? It seems like they can't understand that for whatever reason. And also, like I said, it commits the fallacy of principle number 1, ultimate authority, no neutrality. Every worldview, even the worldview that tries to distinguish between the two. See, what the classical position is saying is be a good little boy and stay over there in the epistemological. Don't come over to the ontological. Or if you're going to go to the ontological, don't go over to the epistemological. You see that? That can't possibly be. And so that can't possibly be. So we don't accept that dichotomy at all. A lot more can be said, obviously, regarding that. We don't surrender the truth of the Christian worldview as we argue for either one of these, okay? Ontological beliefs need to inform and even dictate our epistemological presuppositions, commitments, methods, procedures, arguments, and apologetics whatsoever. I mean, this is being presented as a sound refutation to presuppositionalism. And I've said this before. This gets to our next point, our next clip, okay? I'm going to play this next clip. It gets to the next clip or the next point, because what they're saying here now is that it has to do with your theology. And I've said this time and time again. I've said this again and again, that really the reason why a lot of these folks reject presuppositionalism, they reject it because of Reformed theology. Doug from Pine Creek pointed this out in one of his videos, and he says, I think Emilio is right on this. And I was talking at the time about Mike Winger and statements that I've heard from him, that presuppositionalism is not just the tag argument. It's not just transcendental reasoning. It's much more than that. You got to have the whole Calvinism. You have to have the whole, you have to have the whole presuppositional, you have the whole Reformed faith and all of that. Okay. Fair enough. Fair enough. But it also shows their bias. And it also shows the fallacy of neutrality. No one's neutral, not even in the Arminian and the Reformed debate. No one is neutral at this point. So let's hear his next point here, which is going to be about theology. And what Cameron is asking here is why? Why do these guys go to this method? What attracts them? It's like, what attracts these guys to this method? What's their problem? Why do they like this method so much? This is, again, this is what he says.
The presuppositionalists to adopt that view instead of the classical view.
So this is one of the things I appreciate about the integrity of the presuppositionalists like a Bahnsen. Mm-hmm. And that is, because I think they're right in this regard as far as it goes. that they're insistent that one's apologetic method should track sound theology. Now, people can debate what they think sound theology is, but pending a decision on that, the principle, I think, is intact. Namely, since they are, at least Van Til and Bahnsen, are thoroughgoing Calvinists with a certain view about the noetic effects of sin and the fall and total depravity, then they think that this apologetic method is the only method that's possible given the fallen estate that man is in.
Is it just the fallen state, or do they also look at other scriptures to defend it? Romans 1, for
Well,
instance.
they certainly look at other scriptures in order to bolster the case that this is just, in fact, the way the Bible does apologetics. But even in those instances, it's always because of this fallen state and the noetic effects of sin that man is in this rebellion. As Romans 1 talks about, we suppress the truth in unrighteousness.
Right.
But what's interesting about that passage in Romans, it says the invisible attributes of God are clearly seen through the things that are made, so that they are without excuse. But those things that are clearly seen then are suppress the truth in unrighteousness as it indicts the human race, and then exchanges the creator for the creation. So I see the classical model going, well, this whole problem of us suppressing the truth in unrighteousness is really a moral problem. That's not an apologetics issue. The apologist can't undo someone's suppression of the truth and rebellion against God. That's between them and God through the act of the Holy Spirit. But this exchanging the creator for the creation, I think, is where the apologetics comes in. It says, look, we can leverage an argument to show that his exchanging the creator for the creation is just false. There is the God that we know there to be. We can demonstrate it by sound reason. What they do with that, if they're going to continue to suppress that, that's between them and God. That's not anything that the apologist can touch. So I think the failure to sort of follow it through, they're clearly seen attributes, then the truth is suppressed, and then the creator creation is exchanged. The presuppositionalist sort of forgets that third step, and they think it's just merely a matter, it's clearly seen and it's suppressed. Well, then if that's all the problem is, the only way to unsuppress it is not apologetics, it's evangelism. So indeed, a lot of presuppositionalists would almost say, in fact, I've heard them say things to the effect, really the task force is to preach the gospel, not to try to defend the gospel. And I go, well, but to defend the gospel is going to address that third level there where the creator is exchanged for the creation.
So I think it's good.
Okay, a lot of material there, but if you heard what he says, first of all, is that your apologetics has to track with sound theology. I mean, you heard him talk about theology here. I wonder what his theology is, by the way, because it's very easy. See, in one sense, Reformed folks, we're at a little bit of a disadvantage. Wouldn't you agree? Because our theology is kind of out on the table. We kind of know what we believe. You know, we go back to the Reformed faith. There are confessions. There's the Synod of Dort. We have our theology out on the table. But what has emerged today is this entire configuration of, you know, Arminianism, semi-Pelagianism, Socinianism, and all of this sort of, discombobulated theology that nobody even knows what, you know, it's amazing. For example, I asked Mike Winger. I hate to pick on Mike Winger again here, but it's true. I did talk to him about this, and I asked him, like, can you point me to, I know he's a Thomist. I know he's a Thomist, but theologically, where else is he at? You know, but, Mike Winger tells me that he has no book, no systematic theology. There's no theologians that he would point me to that would somehow represent where he stands theologically. It's a really scary kind of almost like a postmodern approach to Christianity, a complete deconstruction of Christianity, ahistorical, and all of that, you know. And so it's really too bad. But listen to what he's saying here, right? Is you need a track with sound theology and the noetic effects of sin. That's the reason why presuppositionalists take presuppositionalism, is that right there. Classicalists evoke sound reason as the basis of demonstrating the God we know there to be. He says that repeatedly. Try that in a debate, Dr. Howe. We just know him to be there. We know that it's one God, and we know that it's the God of the Bible because Thomas says so. It's really inconsistent if you think about it. But the question is how do you know there to be God at all? Of course, and we've already talked about that. You can't get there through human reason alone. You can't get there just through general revelation, at least not to know who this God is, that he is the true and living revelational God of the Bible, the triune God of the Bible. And you can't know what man knows from general revelation either, unless you have the Bible. The Bible confirms what you see in general revelation. So special revelation, of course, confirming general revelation. Because you got to understand, what you call general revelation, you think the anti-theist believes in general revelation? You think the anti-theist believes in natural theology? Of course not. They don't believe that it's theology at all. They don't think it's revelational at all. It's just a random, chaotic world that has no meaning, no purpose whatsoever. You can also make a case here that Dr. Howe is really more of a fideist in his arguments than anything else. Again, because he says what we know because of sound reason. And we know sound reason is sound because of sound reason. I mean, that's essentially what his argument is. Hello? That sounds completely fallacious and totally arbitrary to me. That's not the presuppositional approach, not at all. So anyway, it's also funny because he comments on Calvinism, tracking to theology, but again, no positive presentation of his theology whatsoever. And so it reminds me so much of what Dr. Craig's videos do, which these guys all basically appeal to their own apologetic, and not to the Bible as the ultimate source. The Bible's always in the background. It's always on the shelf. It's always back there somewhere. We'll bring it in later at a later point. He even talks about that here in this video. But the presuppositional method, he says, is because, why do we adopt it? Why do we have the presup method? He says, because of the noetic effects of sin. Now, that is extremely reductionistic. That is completely, you're just telling half the story there. Not even half the story. It's much, much more than that. What Scripture demands is presuppositionalism because of a lot more than that. Matter of fact, I want to, just real quickly, replay a little bit of that, just so that we get, again, what he says about that very thing. Let's listen real quick.
The classical model go on. Well, this whole problem of us suppressing the truth in unrighteousness is really a moral problem. That's not an apologetics issue. The apologist can't undo someone's suppression of the truth and rebellion against God. That's between them and God through the act of the Holy Spirit. But exchanging the creator for the creation, I think, is where the apologetics comes in. It says, look, we can leverage an argument to show that his exchanging the creator for the creation is just false. There is the God that we know there to be. We can demonstrate it by sound reason. Sound
reason, again, is an assumption. How do you prove your reason is sound? Well, through sound reason, of course. And then we are accused as presuppositionalists of running in a circle because we presuppose God in order to prove God. And then we're accused of being logically fallacious. But did you hear what he said? Well, how do we explain the soundness of our worldview? Through sound reason. I would ask him, how do you know your reason is sound? Through sound reason. I know they hate to play those kinds of tricks, those kinds of games, whatever, but it's not a game. It really exposes the futility of the argument once you really expose it for what it is. Presuppositionalism based on the noetic effects of sin? No, it's a lot more than that. It's the reason why Bahnsen begins his book Always Ready, talking about what is required of us as apologists. What's the biblical requirement? What's the obligation? As Christian apologists, why are we obligated to defend the faith the way that we are? Well, because the Bible demands this because of neutrality. There's no such thing as neutrality, and that's why we begin with a presuppositional transcendental approach. And again, another reason why is because God and Scripture both are presented in Scripture as self-attesting. This gets to the issue of authority. It's not just the noetic effects of sin. It's also we could say negatively, but positively. It is the teaching of Scripture. It is the teaching of Scripture regarding ultimate authority and the self-attesting nature of Scripture and God, those kinds of things. Also, the reality of brute facts. There's no such thing as a brute fact, Dr. Howe. There is no fact that stands on its own by itself. Every fact is sort of pre-interpreted. It's pre-interpreted by something. And as a presuppositionalist, we would say that all facts are pre-interpreted by God. What does that mean? It means they derive their meaning from God. It means that God is the ultimate interpreter of everything. And that's why we can't simply go to reason itself, okay? It's much more than that. So say hi to Trish, everybody. No brute facts. Also, another reason why it's all, why we're presuppositionalists is because of the impossibility of the contrary. And this is what somebody earlier in the comments was talking about. It's pushing the antithesis. It's when you show the impossibility of the contrary that no other worldview can adequately explain why we have the basis for argumentation in the first place. That's why. I mean, that's the whole basis behind our argument is the impossibility of the contrary, something that he didn't even mention, doesn't even mention. I mean, Cameron asked him, why do they take this position? Why do they take this approach? Why do presuppositionalists argue the way that they do? And the only thing that he can mention is the noetic effects of sin. Again, to me, this is not a sound refutation of presup. This is not even a sound representation of presup. The other thing is also because of revelational epistemology. Jesus, according to Colossians chapter 2, is the source of all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge, right? So all treasures of wisdom and knowledge are in Christ. That means that our epistemology is revelational in nature. It's rooted in the person and work of Jesus Christ, which the person and work of Jesus Christ is found where? It's found in the Holy Scriptures. That's where God inscripturated them to be. And also, the reason why we're presuppositional is because we believe what the Bible teaches regarding the preeminence of Christ. Colossians chapter 2, Colossians chapter 1, Colossians chapter 2 is stating the preeminence of Christ, or the way that I've put it is like this, guys. You guys tell me what you think. A presuppositional approach is an approach that is from, through, to, and for Christ. From Christ, because he is the source of all knowledge. It is through Christ, meaning that and where do we get that from? If you have your Bibles, just look real carefully at Colossians chapter 2, verse 8. What do you mean that your theology, your apologetics is through Christ? Well, if you have a philosophy according to the tradition of man, according to the elementary principles of the world, rather than, watch this now, a philosophy according to Christ. That is to say that Christ is your method and means, is the heart and soul of your philosophy and therefore of your argument, of your worldview, and that it is to Christ, meaning that he is the sound conclusion of the argument, and for Christ, meaning it is for the glory of Christ. That's what presuppositionalism really is all about. And so again, guys, thank you guys for your comments. Great, great comments tonight. God bless all of you. And yeah, good stuff. So next, they bring up the issue of Romans chapter 1. Notice what, I mean, for me, I don't know if you guys picked this up, and so I'll play it again.
Do with that, if they're going to continue to suppress that, that's between them and God. That's not anything that the apologists can touch. So I think the failure to sort of follow it through, they're clearly seeing attributes, then the truth is suppressed, and then the creator creation is exchanged. The presuppositionalist sort of forgets that third step, and they think it's just merely a matter, it's clearly seen and it's suppressed. Well, then if that's all the problem is, the only way to unsuppress it is not apologetics, it's evangelism. So,
I'm not even quite certain what or why Dr. Howe has decided to go down this line of thinking. I don't even know what he's talking about, to be quite honest with you. Cameron, if you want, from Capturing Christianity, brother, if you want to come on and explain to me what you guys are even talking about at this juncture, that presuppositional apologetics does not even take into the account the idea of exchanging the glory of the creator for the glory of the creature, you have not read presuppositional apologetics. you have not read Bahnsen, you have not read Van Til, you have not read anybody that is relevant in this area, because there is deep, extensive, detailed exegesis in many of presuppositionalist books that deal extensively with the very act of exchanging the glory as a result of truth suppression. And the fact that he says that the idea of exchanging the glory of God is that's not a moral issue like the others. I don't know. I don't know what he was talking about. It certainly is a moral issue to me. Exchanging the glory of the Creator for the creature is not moral. I don't even know where to begin. That's certainly inconsistent, completely inconsistent with presuppositionalism. We never say that. We've never said that. We'll never say that, because of course that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever to us. And so when they're talking about things like this, it's kind of frustrating for sure, but it's kind of to be expected, because in my experience, I don't know, you tell me what you think, but in my experience, I have seen repeatedly that we just cannot, as a presuppositional community, we just cannot get a fair shake. We just can't get people to fairly and faithfully represent presuppositionalism. There always is misrepresentations of the view, and that's why, you know, I appreciate so much of R.C. Sproul. Because R.C. Sproul, in the debate with Bahnsen, went back, I told you, I listened to it again based on the fact that Dr. Howe is citing it in this video. And at least R.C. Sproul is actually meaningfully interacting with the presuppositional approach and trying to discuss. At least he's saying, I want to understand it more. He said, I want to talk to the disciples of Van Til because of X, Y, and Z. And we all know now that the late, great Dr. R.C. Sproul is a sound presuppositionalist. At least now he is. And I think he's in a place where he can handle that joke. But anyway, I just thought that was extremely telling to me, that for this guy to say that exchanging the glory of the Creator and the creature, that's not a moral issue or something like that. That's an apologetic issue only. I don't get where these dichotomies come from, to be quite honest with you. I don't understand why they insist on just mutilating the Christian worldview in this way, that we have to accept these kinds of false dichotomies everywhere. It's both. It's epistemic, it's moral, it's noetic, it's everything. It's psychological, it's emotional, it's everything. It has to do with what it means to be man, what it means to be covenantally in relationship with God. But then again, if I use the word covenantal, there you go. That's my old Calvinism kicking in, and that automatically means that, I'm wrong, and that, I have theological reasons for adopting this and that. It gets kind of frustrating. So in this next clip, he actually begins to talk positively about his own apologetic as a Thomist. And he begins to describe how Thomism, where does it lead you, and how far do you get with Thomistic philosophy? Does it get you all the way to the God of the Bible? Let's see. Let's just listen to what Dr. Howe and Cameron have to say on this point.
Third level there, where the Creator is exchanged for the creation.
So I think it's good that presuppositionalists have such a high view of Christianity and Scripture, and that's one of the things they say that is bad with the classical approach, is that you're not sort of assuming that Christianity is true, and that's like the greatest good, that's the greatest thing to believe. And so but in the classical view, so for instance, when I'm giving a presentation on the Kalam cosmological argument, that doesn't necessarily lead all the way to Christianity is true. And that's one of the things that presuppositionalists don't like.
That's
is
right.
the fact that you're not going all the way to Christianity every single time, all the time.
No, and
I think that's
agree
a
with the presuppositionalist.
Exactly, yeah.
Yes. So I'm sorry, I never interrupted you.
No, that was it.
But I think that they're right, and though I like the Kalam argument, I think it is true that it only gives you some minimal facts, which maybe in a lot of situations that's enough. People conclude, well, you've got somebody that made the universe, sounds like God, and they're off and running. Okay, fine. But a person who's going to push back and go, well, the Kalam doesn't prove that whoever created the universe still exists. Maybe he created the universe and went out of existence. Doesn't prove that he's good. Doesn't prove that he's personal necessarily, unless you add the additional elements that's additional to the argument. So I agree with all that. That's why, as a Thomist, I would say, yeah, but Aquinas' argument, interestingly, not only gives you the...
Wait, which argument? Which Thomist argument?
Well, all of them, actually. But they're parsed out as the 5 ways.
Right.
But the one that I typically give more often is the way that is the argument he gives in his On Being and Essence, which traffics in the distinction between essence and existence.
Okay.
Whatever that means.
Isn't that the 4th way? So the 4th
No,
way
it's
is
not. No.
Oh, it's not any of the ways.
It is infused through all 5 ways, but
Okay.
it's explicitly given in On Being and Essence in a version or in a wording that is not as easy to see in the 5. So it's usually easier for me to just kind of cut to here's the kernel of all of those arguments, and it traffics in this essence existence distinction, whatever that ends up being.
And so is your point that from here we can go all the way to Christianity?
More than that.
Okay.
That
More than that?
Yes. More than that in the sense that not that we can go all the way to Christianity, but that the demonstration of God in Aquinas' argument inexorably entails all the superlative attributes of God. Now, it may not be all the way to Christianity in the sense that it gives us special revelation. So I'll grant that it doesn't give us that, but it gives us the God of classical theism, which is there's only one God, so the God of classical theism would have to be the God of the Bible. When it comes to if the presuppositionalist or a critic of the classical method says, well, it doesn't give us all the way to Christianity, if by that it means it doesn't give us the Bible yet, I would concede that. And then I would say that's because I can give additional arguments for why we know that the Bible is God's revelation of himself, his special revelation, which is different than the arguments of natural theology and his existence. But what I deny is that the God that's delivered by this classical method of Aquinas, I deny the fact that the God that he gives us is some kind of minimal theism, as it's often described in some of the presuppositional literature. No,
so
it's
you
not
would say
minimal.
it's classical theism.
It's
that it gives
absolutely.
us.
It's simplicity, it's immutability, it's immateriality, it's all good.
Omnipotence,
omnipotence. All of the classical attributes of God cascade inexorably from this simple demonstration of God's existence, and then the sort of fountainhead of the attributes would be simplicity. And then once simplicity is explained, then all the other attributes follow inevitably and unavoidably. And since there is only one God, then that has to be the God of the Bible.
I'm tempted to go off track here and just...
Well, he does kind of go off track here, but man, I tell you what, a longer clip there for sure, but a really important clip, guys, because you heard so much by way of Thomistic philosophy. The reason why I reject Thomism 100%, at least just in terms of its refusal to admit its Christian presuppositions. You will hear in the writings of Van Til repeatedly, even as I've read, a support of something like what Thomas says in the 5 ways, but he says those 5 ways only make sense if we're honest about our Christian presuppositions. Of course, by arguing about, the being an essence or whatever, the ontological argument, by arguing about these things, you have not thereby established the basis of the argument. And this is why we'll always be, in a sense, like 2 ships passing in the night. Because while Dr. Howe wants to operate simply on the nuts and bolts of classical arguments, he never arrives at the foundations of those arguments in a transcendental fashion. That is to say, he never wants to admit the Christian presuppositions upon which he is operating in order to make the kinds of claims regarding Thomism in the first place. I read the 5 ways. I read the 5 ways recently. And in reading the 5 ways, I could track over and over where Thomas repeatedly engages in Christian presuppositions. He just is not... See, remember I said, the 3 principles of presuppositionalism are what? Ultimate authority, everybody has one because that's the nature of worldviews. Number 2 is epistemological self-consciousness. And this is precisely where this entire enterprise of classical apologetics is running aground. because it is not epistemically aware. It is refusing to be honest with its Christian presuppositions, and therefore, when they make their cosmological column argument or teleological or whatever arguments, their argument for motion or whatnot, when they're making those arguments, upon which basis are such arguments built? You have not accounted for the laws of logic. You have not accounted for consciousness. You have not accounted for meaning or morals or beauty. You have not accounted for any of those things within your worldview. These are all assumed, shared. And then listen how often he says, well, we know there's only one God, and we know that has to be the God of the Bible. It's funny because later on in the video, and I don't think we'll get to it today, but later on in the video, he's going to repeatedly argue for the fact that presuppositionalism is false because a Muslim can just adopt the argument and say, oh, you're not presupposing Allah, you're not presupposing the Quran, you're not presupposing Islam, you're not presupposing, Islamic, theology and all of these things. And so we just attribute all of the terminology of presuppositionalism to the Muslim faith, and it shows that anybody can argue transcendentally or presuppositionally. Okay, I won't deal with that here and now. I don't agree with that. But here, in a sense, it's really irony of irony. You guys tell me what you think. But it's remarkable to be that where did Thomas Aquinas acquire his classical approach? Well, some say he acquired it from Aristotle. Okay, certainly there is a connection. I think the Mass is probably ultimate proof of that. Form and essence and all of that. But the Muslims had acquired Aristotelian logic long before Thomas was ever around. And some would even argue that Thomas Aquinas looked across the horizon and saw that Islam was becoming rational, while Christianity, as he understood it, Christendom, was essentially fideistic. And so he tried to kind of put some skin on the bones, and he adopted a rationalist approach to Christendom. Thus, you have rationalism that looks a lot like what the Muslims would argue. Only a transcendental, covenantal, biblical apologetic that does not set aside the basis of Christian presuppositions can truly be said to be arguing Christianly. And so in many ways, they're laying aside principle number one, ultimate authority. Principle number two, not being epistemically aware and not being honest, therefore, about your presuppositions. And number three, arguing by way of presuppositions or pushing the antithesis to show that without the Christian worldview, you can't know anything for certain whatsoever. And that statement itself is also known uniquely through Christianity. And so for Dr. Howe here to be talking about the fact that, look, classicalism, it doesn't get you all the way to God. I mean, is that what we're teaching people in Sunday school? I'm going to teach you an apologetic today in Sunday school. I'm going to teach you an apologetic today. Here we are in the Church of God, okay, Sunday school teacher. And I'm going to teach you an apologetic that's not going to get you to God. I mean, is this what we're supposed to be teaching in our Sunday schools at church? How about the pastor comes up on a Sunday morning and says, hey, I'm going to teach you an apologetic, but it's not going to get you to the God of the Bible. So you'll have to come back for that some other time because these arguments are going to get you close, but not all the way there. What is close to Christianity? It's not Christianity. It's non-Christianity. Theism is not Trinitarian theism. It's just not. And so then it completely begs the question, what are we supposed to be arguing for as Christians? And so what they say is, well, it's pretty clear from Acts chapter 17 and other places in the Bible that the people in the Bible are doing just that. They're arguing first for general theism before moving on to more specific items of Christian theism. We reject that patently, and I've covered Acts chapter 17 and 14 already. I can do it again. And then all the Psalms that talk about general revelation and such. None of those things, folks, are arguing for general theism unless you are prepared to say that general theism is talking about Yahweh. It is not, or that Yahweh is capable of meaning something like general theism. Notice that Dr. Howe repeatedly talks about how these arguments do not go all the way to God, that these arguments do not take you all the way to the God of the Bible, and that these arguments do not provide you revelation. And so he would admit that on the basis of that criteria, it's not really giving you an argument for God, not the true and living God. And so we have some decisions to make as apologists. I guess I'll end the program there, guys. We have decisions to make as Christian apologists. What are we going to be defending? Are we going to be defending something that's close to true biblical Christian theism, or are we going to defend biblical Christianity? Furthermore, when you look at the Bible, what are you commanded to defend? I'll read it again one more time for us. This is Paul in Colossians chapter 2, verse 8. See, even by appealing to the scriptures, my sentiment is that people like Cameron, people like Dr. Howe, they're going to look at that and be like, that is so old-fashioned. That's so unnecessary. That is so completely, we can't do that. That's just question begging. That's an appeal to authority. You cannot just go to the Bible. Man, I tell you what, I can't tell you how many videos I've watched where somebody like William Lane Craig is presenting an argument for Molinism or an argument for the column argument, and someone in the audience that has paid money to come to his seminar says, yeah, but doesn't the Bible say X, Y, and Z? To which Dr. Craig repeatedly says, oh, that's just the Bible. We'll get to that eventually. We're not even there yet. Just like Dr. Howe. He talked in this video, I don't know. How long is this video? Probably, close to half an hour, right? He talked for half an hour, 45 minutes about Christian apologetics, but he doesn't ground his apologetic from the Bible. I mean, to me, that's cause for serious concern. And so when we just look at what Paul says, he says, look to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deception. According to what? When he says according to, what he is saying here is according to, meaning here's referring to a worldview. According to a worldview that is rooted in the tradition of man, according to a worldview that is rooted in the elementary principles of the world. That's what rationalism is. That's what Thomism is. That's what Aristotelianism is. It's traditions and principles of the world, and he says here, rather than according to Christ. And so, once again, folks, I just wanted to interact with this video because I think when you put out a video like this and make the bold claim that you have marshaled a sound refutation to presuppositional apologetics, I think it deserves a response from someone. And so hopefully at least I've kind of started a conversation in the right direction. Again, one more time, invitation to Capturing Christianity. If you want to come on the program or have me on your program or have somebody else, because I know Cameron has told us we only want scholars, and so we only want academics and stuff like that. But yet, then again, he has like Mike Winger on the show all the time. But I don't know, whatever. But you got to have someone. Hey, Cameron, you got to have somebody in there to represent presuppositionalism along the lines of a true Vantilian approach to apologetics. If you don't, you're just kind of, you're just kind of patting yourself in the back. And so I hope you can do that. Anyway, thanks, guys, for listening to the program. I want to look at your comments here for a section, say thank you to everybody that was commenting tonight. I hope you appreciated that. You tell me what you think about the video, and also put your comments down below in the video section. I'm going to link all kinds of great resources and books and things below the YouTube channel here, and I want you to take advantage of those resources. And coming up here in the weeks to come at Red Grace Media, we're going to do all kinds of stuff. I'm working on trying to get a presuppositionalist, a Vantilian scholar, we could say, I want to get Camden Busey on the program to join us and talk about Van Til. That should be a lot of fun. I talked to him today, and that should be coming up. And so we'll have a good time with Camden if we do in fact get that going, and hopefully that will be a meaningful interaction with somebody that has extensive experience in Presup and Van Tilian apologetics and theology. So anyway, hope you guys enjoyed the show. That's our program for tonight. God bless you guys.